From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the reading and literacy promotion arm of the library. And we promote books, reading, literacy, and libraries here at the Library of Congress through programs such as this Books and Beyond talk, but we also do so around the country through a network of state centers for the book and also reading promotion partners. Here at the library, it's largely through the National Book Festival that we play a key role in promoting both books and reading, as well as the Library of Congress itself, and through Books and Beyond talks, such as the one you've joined us for today. The Books and Beyond talks started in 1996, and from that period we've had over 300 of them. And they're basically noontime talks by people who have new books that have something to do with the Library of Congress. And often what the connection is something that we determine in various ways. The bulk of them are talks that are based on our resources, and of course we love that. But some also are related to projects that the library has funded or publications that we have supported and that we have every reason to try to publicize. All of the talks are not only, they're filmed for our website and shown on the Library of Congress and the Center for the Book website, so I want to ask you to turn off all things electronic. And we will have a presentation by our author, Stephen Grant, and a brief question and answer period following with the book signing at 1 o'clock. So if you would like to ask questions, your asking that question also gives us the permission, thank you very much, to possibly include you in your question, and certainly Stephen's answer on our website. I was especially happy when Stephen approached us about the possibility of having a program relating to his book. Now I have to confess that this was a number of years ago, as this book was underway.
That's the way it goes.
Because I have known Stephen since he gave his first book talk at the Library of Congress, which was, I looked it up today, for his first book. And it was in relation to that book, which was Peter Strickland, New London Shipmaster, Boston Merchant, First Consul to Senegal. And he spoke here on March the 22nd, 2007. And we're very pleased that he did a whole research job and a whole writing job and produced a beautiful book in the ensuing 7 years. When I first met Stephen after his talk, I told him a couple of my L.C. Shakespeare stories. And while I'm sure that had nothing to do with the actual inspiration, he reminded me of them this morning when we saw each other again. One was that my very first paper that I ever wrote in junior high school was on the Folger Shakespeare Library. It wasn't on the Library of Congress, even though I have been the director of the Center for the Book since it was created back in 1977. But the more I think about that paper, the less I want to talk about it, because I now realize I copied it out of the Encyclopedia Americana. And when I told my wife Nancy about this, she said, I had a similar experience, but I had a teacher who told me that this was something you should never do. The second experience, of course, has to do with the Thomas Jefferson Building. And as a historian and student of the history of the art and architecture of the Jefferson Building, who has worked on several books connected with them, I also had a very small role in the Shakespeare in America exhibit and the Library of Congress's part in it, which was in 2007. And with Martha Hopkins from the Interpretive Programs Office, I cooked up a Shakespeare tour, a Shakespeare-themed tour of the Jefferson building, which I gave about 3 times, and the idea is one I hope the library will pursue even further, and that is, since the Jefferson building's iconography is filled with authors and literary figures, to actually take a look at what is there and why it's there and see what we can extract from that. And it also led me to doing a count in my first book about, it's called On These Walls, Inscriptions and Quotations at the Library of Congress, to see which authors were most represented. And yes, it was Shakespeare, but it was a close call, and by that representation I mean in the iconography, quotations or inscriptions or images, or if you've seen the wonderful Jefferson building and looked up to see the names of writers which adorn that wonderful great hall. And there's kind of a hierarchy. The people who picked those names, you know, were thinking of the great classical writers, but we soon started to slip James Fenimore Cooper up there, and then George Bancroft, the American historian, got up there soon. And then pretty soon they said, to heck with it, we'll do a whole American hall. And as you go into the main reading room, where you used to go to the main reading room from the mall in the front entrance, they've taken a number of American figures, not just writers, but organized them according to kind of fields of knowledge, which is another one of our themes. But the funny part of that is they got pretty excited about getting American names up there, and sometimes mixed up fathers and sons, which we learned when we tried to do the index to the book. But Shakespeare conquered all, and the writer that comes in number 2, and you'll know why when I tell you when the building was built, was 1886 until 1897, and that writer was Tennyson. So that building is really Shakespeare and Tennyson. But today, Stephen is going to give us a new perspective on our next door neighbor. I stole a line from him right there. And I know he will be telling us about the background of the book, but let me tell you just for a minute a couple of things about Stephen himself. He graduated from Amherst College, never suspecting that he would write the Amherst-related book he will be discussing and signing with us today. Correct?
Yes.
I knew it. He earned his doctorate in education from the University of Massachusetts. Next, a Middlebury College master's degree in French at the Sorbonne in Paris, prior to teaching as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ivory Coast, West Africa. He was a career Foreign Service officer with the U.S. Agency for International Development, holding long-term assignments in Ivory Coast, Guinea, Egypt, Indonesia, and El Salvador. He currently serves at the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training in Arlington, Virginia, where he helps retired diplomats prepare their manuscripts for publication. And it was in relationship to this series that I've already mentioned that I first met Stephen. After 7 years, please join me in welcoming Stephen Grant back to the Library of Congress.
Thank you very much, John. The Folger Shakespeare Library has waited 82 years for the first book-length biography that has been written about the founders. May I introduce you to your neighbors across the street. Eliza Jane Clark Folger, called Lida, with first son Henry Clay Folger, Jr., born in New York City in 1857. She was good with figures, a skill that Henry inherited and put to use in his oil business life and in his book buying life. Henry holds in his hands the first of the 92,000 books he acquired. Emily Jordan, in 1860, the youngest of 3 sisters, all of whom went to Vassar College in the 1870s. She was born in Ohio, lived in Washington, D.C., then Elizabeth, New Jersey, and then Brooklyn for most of her adult life. Her father campaigned for Abraham Lincoln, who appointed her father solicitor in the Treasury. Emily met President Lincoln in the Executive Mansion and wrote a short story about the meeting. Henry Folger attended P.S. School number 15 in Brooklyn, then the Adelphi Academy in Brooklyn, graduating from Amherst in 1879, junior Phi Beta Kappa. He was fifth in his class. He excelled in oratory and in music. He performed in one of the early American productions of HMS Pinafore in 1878. What surprised people was that when he came on stage, he had a booming bass voice, and at the same time, when you looked at Henry Folger, he was a slight man. He was 5'4" and weighed 115 pounds. Emily Jordan went to Miss Ranney's school in Elizabeth, New Jersey, graduated from Vassar in 1879, elected president of her class for life. She loved astronomy. She might have become an astronomer. She also liked the theater. Her older sister started as a librarian at Vassar and then was lured to Smith College, where she became the head of the English department. And if there are any Smithies in the audience, Jordan House is named after Emily's older sister. This studio portrait from 1885 shows the Folgers with the Pratts. Henry Folger is on the right. He's grown a mustache. His wife, Emily, is seated, and her elbow is in the lap of Mary Seymour Pratt. Mary Seymour Pratt's husband is above her. His name was Charles M. Pratt. So this Charles Pratt and Henry Folger were roommates at Amherst, and Emily Jordan and Mary Seymour were at Vassar at the same time. You know something about the collection of Shakespeare books that are across the street, but you also might be interested in the fact that Henry Folger was on the lookout for books collected by some of his family and friends. So at the same time that he would go through an auction catalog and look at the Shakespeare, for the Pratts, his closest friends, their passion was butterflies. And Henry bought 1,400 books about butterflies that he offered to the Pratts at Christmas and at their birthdays. All of these volumes are in the Amherst College Library. The father of the roommate, Charles Pratt, was Charles Pratt Sr., pictured here, who was the founder of Pratt Institute in Brooklyn in 1887. He was head of the Adelphi Academy Board. That's where he got to know Henry Folger, his son's close friend. And Charles Pratt became Henry Folger's mentor. Charles Pratt was the largest oil refiner in the country in 1869, and he will come back into the story when we get to the Rockefeller part of this story. While you are studying these faces for recognition, I will share the fact that 2 years ago I wrote an article for Washington History, the journal of the Historical Society of Washington. And the editor let it be known that I was giving them too many illustrations of white men in white shirts. But these are particularly important for the Folger story. This is Charles Moore, chairman of the powerful U.S. Commission on Fine Arts, who had to approve the architectural plans for the Folger Shakespeare Library because they were on Capitol Hill. He might have been lukewarm, but au contraire, he thought they were marvelous. He was sick of columns, endless columns of pillars. He was sick of pediments way up high that you have to crane your neck to look at. So he really approved of the architecture of Paul Cray, as we'll see later. This is Alexander B. Trowbridge, whom Folger hired to be the consulting architect. The consulting architect was one who would play the role of a buffer between the client and the principal architect. He also became the consulting architect for the Adams Building. And if you look at the Folger Shakespeare Library and the Adams Building, you probably do that every day, and you compare the aluminum grill work on the windows, the tall, narrow windows, you can see the affinity. This is Dwight Morrow, who had been ambassador to Mexico and was a partner at J.P. Morgan. His role was important because he was the financial brains behind the decision of Amherst College to accept the phrase in Henry Folger's will, "I would like Amherst College to administer the Folger Library." We'll get back to the will in a minute. Folger had misgivings about having a government institution administering his private research library. Dwight Morrow is better known for his having been the father-in-law of Charles Lindbergh. The terms of Folger's will were that if Amherst College did not agree to administer the Folger, the next choice would have been University of Chicago. If they had declined, then it would have been the Library of Congress who would have an opportunity of managing the Folger. And Dwight Morrow was the one who had to look at the finances in 1932. Folger had left behind a fortune when he died in 1930, which was worth about half that a couple of years later. This is the French-born architect, Paul-Philippe Cret, who was chosen by Alexander Trowbridge with no competition to be the principal architect of the Folger. He was already known in Washington. He had designed the Pan American Union. He had designed also the Federal Reserve. He was a professor of design at Penn. His neoclassical style pleased the Folgers very much. He had a strong French accent, and often Folger needed an interpreter for meetings with him. Perhaps you will agree with me how much more interesting men with white shirts are if they have a book in their hand. And you will also perhaps see some friends here. This is Dr. Abraham Simon Wolf Rosenbach of Philadelphia, the erudite book dealer who provided more books to Henry Folger than anyone else. He had a PhD in English literature. He played Henry Folger off another collector, Henry E. Huntington of the Huntington Library and Museum. But these were times when both of his clients displayed an amazing amount of cordiality in their relationships. There were no fights. Henry would say, "Dr. Rosenbach, I will let Mr. Huntington have this one, but the next one is for me." The Rosenbach Library has the correspondence with both customers, which is fun to read. It's in their museum on Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. James Waldo Fawcett of the Washington Evening Star was hired by Emily after Henry Folger died to write the biography of Henry Folger. He abandoned the project at an early stage, leaving the field open 75 years later for me. there is Henry Huntington, who had deeper pockets than Henry Folger. He was interested in a lot more than Shakespeare, however. And you can visit in San Marino, California, the LA suburb, his library, his museum, and his extensive gardens. 3 biographies have already been written about Huntington, one of them commissioned by the Huntington. And that's 1,100 pages. So if you look at both of the collectors to whom I devote one chapter of their rivalry, it's about time that we have a Folger biography. Herbert Putnam is probably a familiar face to many of you here. Longest serving Librarian of Congress for 40 years. In 1928, there was a very moving exchange, cable exchange between Herbert Putnam and Henry Folger. We'll get to some of the details, but you are aware that in the middle 20s, the Library of Congress was looking for additional property since the now called Jefferson building was running out of space. And they came upon the nearby plot number 760 and had legislation going through Congress so they would have the whole plot. As it happened, Henry Folger had been secretly buying up 14 red brick row houses called Grant's Row, and read in the paper that what he had been doing was perhaps for naught. And he wrote a cable to Herbert Putnam saying, "Do I have to look somewhere else for a location to build my library? I have bought these homes over an 8-year period." This is Herbert Putnam's daughter, Brenda Putnam, sculptor, who designed the statue of Puck, which is in the west garden of the Folger. Actually, the one that's in the west garden now is not the original marble one because it had been a victim of vandalism as well as erosion. So if you want to see the original one, you go inside and it's just the left of the theater entrance, and the one you see outside is cast aluminum. One of the last papers that Folger signed before he died was the contract with Brenda Putnam for the Puck statue. At the same time, Emily Folger was advancing money to a different woman sculptor to make another statue of Folger, of Puck, for the same location in the West Garden. So while Emily and Henry saw eye to eye on most things, every now and then you will read in this book that a few times they differed. The caption of the statue, "Lord, what fools these mortals be." If you look at the statue, some people think that Puck is looking at Congress. But if you look at the statue carefully, and then you turn around and you look at the eyes, where the eyes are facing, it was not Congress. It was the Library of Congress where her father worked. Several years later, a man by the name of Peter Gazzola from Rye, New York, knocked on the Folger door. And he said, "I was the model for Puck." Any recognition of this gentleman? This is William Adams Slade, who was the first director of the Folger Shakespeare Library. He was detached from the Library of Congress, where he was chief bibliographer in October of 1930. He was the Folger's choice to be the first director of the Folger. And the appointment was made by the Amherst College trustees. 4 years later, the Amherst trustees sent out a very curt message. Mr. Slade will be returning to the Library of Congress and doing work he prefers to his present administrative duties. So there had been a falling out between the Amherst trustees and this man who was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Brown University in 1898, a prolific writer. He had published a book of sonnets. Emily liked him, but the trustees thought he was a weak administrator. Another person familiar to many people in the Library of Congress is John Franklin Jameson. He was head of research at the Carnegie Institution, co-founder of the American Historical Society, and later curator of manuscripts at the Library of Congress. In 1919, the Folgers came to Washington, D.C., and Henry asked his classmate, "Jamie," he said, "do you think I should build my library in Washington?" Jameson said, 40 years ago, I would have said no. But now I say yes. And so this man, Jameson, who was the valedictorian of his class, was looked up to by Henry, who was only fifth in his class, and they kept up a friendship. They also kept up a friendship because Jameson was the class secretary for the class of 1879 at Amherst. And in 1904, Jameson asked Folger, "What have you been doing for the last 5 years?" And here's what Folger wrote. "I can report no children born, no books written, no degrees received. The nights have been employed in bringing together a library of Shakespeareana. In the gathering of books, I have been signally fortunate during these years, quite beyond my greatest hopes, and have made a collection of material illustrating Shakespeare, which I believe will soon be notable." You may recognize this picture. It's on the cover of my biography. It was taken in the founder's room of the Folger. Emily is wearing a purple velvet gown that belonged to the Shakespearean actress Julia Marlowe, who wore it when she played Portia. The Folgers spent every spring vacation in Hot Springs, Virginia, at the Homestead luxury resort. They stayed in the same accommodations. Emily went there mainly for her health, to take the baths. Henry went there to play golf. And in order to get from the accommodations to the bathhouse, you had a long serpentine corridor. And the grandes dames who would go to the Homestead developed the custom of dressing up as they go from accommodations to bathhouse and back. And Emily wore her Julia Marlowe Portia gown. Frank Salisbury and his wife on a transatlantic journey. Salisbury was known as Britain's painter laureate. He painted the Folgers in 2 oil portraits, which are in the reading room. He painted John D. Rockefeller Jr. He painted Marjorie Merriweather Post, and this painting is at Hillwood. You've probably seen it. He was also the first artist to paint Queen Elizabeth II. This is the Salisbury portrait of Emily, which is in the old reading room at the Folger. She's in her academic robe. She's wearing Vassar pink. In her hand, she has a fan from a scene from Henry V. Henry is wearing his Amherst purple and white hood. In his hand, he's holding one of his favorite books, a 1619 compilation of Shakespeare plays referred to as the Pavier Quartos. Henry received an honorary degree of letters at Amherst in 1914. These are the Hoovers, President and First Lady Lou Hoover, as they are walking into the Folger Library for its dedication on Shakespeare's birthday, April 23rd, 1932. Hoover has been our only president who is a bibliophile. At the end of the ceremony, Emily was quite emotional because she had to go through this ceremony of dedication without her husband, who died 2 years early. And the First Lady saw this and got up and helped Emily off the stage. The Folgers attended his 45th reunion at Amherst. Here they are. They each attended their 50th reunions at Amherst and Vassar, fairly rare for the time. This is a poignant moment when, in 1932, Emily is looking at the portrait of her deceased husband. She now is wearing an Amherst robe because she has received an honorary doctorate in letters. Folger saved a lot of items that I was able to go through in the underground vault. He saved a lot of correspondence. He dealt with 600 book dealers, 150 in London alone. So he has the correspondence, he has the invoices, he has the bid lists that he sent, and the mailing labels, such as this one. This man was Henry Folger's boss for 49 years. This is the young John D. Rockefeller, who founded the Standard Oil of Ohio in 1870, relocated to New York 2 years later. He bought out Charles Pratt, who was the largest oil refiner in the country. Rockefeller was not college educated, and he admired Folger, who was. If any of you own the volume or have seen the volume America by Alistair Cooke, you might remember on page 256 this image of John D. Rockefeller in the center, wearing gloves. He is walking back to Standard Oil Company on 26 Broadway from antitrust hearings in the Customs House. He looks very glum, as do the two young attorneys behind him, who probably were up all night preparing statements for him. On the right, you will see delighted messenger boys, happy to get out for part of the day. And on the left, you will see a man holding package on the left. That is Henry Folger, who literally is Rockefeller's right-hand man. Folger had an almost encyclopedic memory about the history of the company. And when Standard Oil was asked to write about the history, he's the one that wrote that. In his hand, he's probably carrying stenographic trial records. He was also very calm and unflappable during interrogations. This is a 1919 letter from John D. Rockefeller to his accountant. In 1919, Rockefeller was 80 years old. He had stepped down from being head of Standard Oil of New Jersey, but he still was very much involved in decisions, and he kept on sending messages to many of his colleagues. And the line that I particularly draw your attention to is, "I regard Mr. Folger's paper as good as gold and his collateral of the best." What had happened was that Henry Folger needed money to buy Shakespeare, and he had run out of his own. Yes, he had a good salary. Yes, he had a lot of Standard Oil investments. But when you look at the auction catalog and you see what's coming up, and you need to get money in a hurry, you go to the people who have the money and will loan it to you. In 1919, Henry Folger had advanced from being a statistical clerk in 1879 to being president of Standard Oil of New York, that later became Mobil Oil Corporation. And when he says that his collateral is of the best, the collateral that he used was Standard Oil of New York collateral. I mentioned that the Folgers saved everything, such as correspondence, mailing labels. Henry saved all of his canceled checks. They are in 4 archival boxes that I postponed until I had looked at everything else, because how was I going to go through 10,000 checks? However, I discovered a gold mine. A checkbook is an autobiography. It shows where your values lie. This is a check for $53,000, which is $800,000 today, to John D. Rockefeller in repayment for a loan to buy Shakespeare. One of the perks of being a senior executive during the first 20 years of the last century was that you had an oil tanker named after you. This is the H.C. Folger, launched in San Francisco in 1916. And would you expect Henry Folger to be there for the christening? He didn't go. I know what he was doing that day because I've been through his correspondence. He was applying for a loan for $20,000 from a bank to buy more Shakespeare. These oil tankers held 100,000 barrels of petroleum products in 18 storage tanks, and this vessel made many crossings during the First War. Once a torpedo missed the Folger by 50 yards. Henry Folger loved golf. He and Rockefeller played every morning at 10 when their schedules permitted it. Henry was not powerful on the fairway, but he was deadly on the green, which is where you make most of your shots. He's playing with a Schenectady putter, which later was outlawed due to the intervention of Bobby Jones. Folger won a number of senior cups, and I visited the Nassau Country Club in Glen Cove, and they said, I think we have one of these cups in the basement, and they found it. Have any of you heard that John D. Rockefeller used to hand out coins to people? He had his valet stuff his pockets with nickels and dimes every morning. And he would give these to friends, complete strangers. But on the golf course, if someone like Folger would sink a 16-foot putt, he'd get a few dimes. Folger never did anything with them. He put them in the top bureau drawer. But after he died, Emily opened the drawer and said, I have an idea what I can do with these dimes. And she had a watch band made out of the dimes. Each of the Mercury dimes is dated 1920, and they're in the Folger Library vault. In 1956, the CEO of Mobil Oil wrote to the director of the Folger Library and said, we have come across Henry Folger's partner's desk that he used with great pleasure for many years. Would you like to have it? It's a walnut partner's desk with ornaments, drawers on both sides. And the Folger said, yes, we'd love to have it. And since that time, it's been used as the Folger's director's desk in an office that looks out on the Capitol. This may be difficult for you to see, but this is a sketch that Henry Folger made in his hand in 1918, and he sent it to a real estate agent. It's a sketch of 4 locations near the Capitol that he had in mind for his library. The letter, which was sent from the homestead, said, "Please inquire very cautiously about these 4 locations for my library." Can you see the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, or is it too difficult? Yeah. This image is in my book, so you could look at it at leisure if you took it home. So number 2 is where the Folger is. Across the street is the Lutheran Church of the Reformation, number 4, also built in the 30s. And north of that church is the Supreme Court, built at the end of the 30s. But when Folger was looking at the properties in 1918, 1919, the site for the Supreme Court was identified as future government building. And the 4th location, number 1, is where the Madison is now. This is Grant's Row. My name is Grant, but I'm not related to Albert Grant, who was an engineer from Milwaukee, a Union veteran, who built these red brick row houses in the 1870s of an Italianate design. These were the 14 houses that it took the Folgers 8.5 years to buy up one after the other when the leases expired, or when the real estate agent representing the Folgers could persuade the owners to look for another location. This face probably will not be familiar. This is George D. Olds, professor of mathematics at Amherst, president of Amherst between 1924 and 1927. On March 23rd, 1928, he wrote to Henry Folger, "I have just taken lunch with Dr. Putnam and congratulated him. I wish you could see his enthusiasm over your gift. He at once took me out to the end of one of the north corridors in order that I might see with my own eyes the site you have been so quietly and wisely providing. The setting will be perfect for your jewels. I'm in the middle of several weeks of research, and here have found the library an ideal spot for the scholar. It's not alone that the material is at hand and available at a moment's notice, but of only minor importance is the fact that every member of the staff seems to have caught the contagion of Dr. Putnam's sympathetic personality, and one lives in an atmosphere of rare helpfulness. So I rejoice beyond words in your benefaction. Washington is fast becoming, or actually is, the intellectual center of our country." So this other strong voice from Amherst College is similar to the attitude of Folger's classmate, Jameson, saying that this is time to have such a rare cultural contribution to the U.S. Capitol. I think it's quite interesting that a college president, as soon as he stepped down, hastened to the Library of Congress to do research. I wonder how often that takes place today. This man is George A. Plimpton, who at the time, 1928, was president of GIN, and he was chairman of the Board of Trustees of Amherst College. Grandfather of the mid-20th century author and editor of the Paris Review, George Plimpton. Plimpton wrote to Henry on April 9th, 1928, which is 86 years ago today. My dear Folger, I am glad that the question as to where your Shakespeare books will go has finally been settled, and it seems to me very satisfactorily. I have had a good many talks with Herbert Putnam, and if he lives long enough, he is going to make Washington, from the book standpoint, a mecca for scholars. And as you know, Herbert Putnam lived to be 94. Grant's Row is now gone forever. On December 24th, 1929, Herbert Putnam wrote Henry Folger, "We are watching with absorption the rapid progress in the demolition of the old building. Indeed, our employees on that side confess that the thrill of it keeps their eyes away from their desks." Calvin Coolidge. Amity Schley's, in her biography last year of Calvin Coolidge, writes that she consulted Calvin Coolidge's White House appointment books, which are in the manuscript division of the Library of Congress. Well, I did too. And I was amazed at how empty the appointment calendar was, day after day, except for his daily briefing of the press. What I was looking for and what I found was a meeting that took place between Robert Luce, who was the Republican chair of the House Committee on the Library, who went to see President Coolidge to lobby to add the Folger Library to Plot 760 and to change the legislation so that it wouldn't be only the annex, which became the Adams Building, but 1/4 of that plot would be devoted to the Folger. And that is what happened. Calvin Coolidge was an Amherst classmate of Dwight Morrow, and they were both math students of Professor George Olds. Coolidge became the chair of the Folger Committee of the Amherst trustees. This is a photo of the library before it opened. You can see scaffolding around the low relief friezes on the left. And you see there are no columns, there's no high pediment. You see the aluminum grillwork and the tall, narrow windows. A crowd is gathering around President Hoover's limousine on April 23rd, 1932, Shakespeare's 368th birthday, when the library was dedicated. This was the largest cultural gathering in D.C. to date. And if some of you live in Capitol Hill and grew up on Capitol Hill for a few generations, it could be that your great-grandparents were in this crowd. On May 1st, a small plane from Hoover Airport, where the Pentagon is now, took off and took the first aerial picture of the Folger Library, which you can see on East Capitol Street. Here is a close-up. This is a letter from Henry Folger to Herbert Putnam, which I found in the manuscript division. It's dated January 1930, 6 months before Folger died. And Folger is referring to a book which had come out about Dr. Putnam. And he says, and it was a 550-page book. And Folger writes, I have been wondering a great deal whether I will ever be able to get a 550-page volume published in my honor. I found this quite surprising because Folger was very reticent, very self-effacing, very quiet. But toward the end of his life, he perhaps began to think, I have my name attached to a library, but will someone write about me? And it's taken a long time for that to happen in a book form. I'm often asked now, since the book is out, to provide a photo, an author's photo. My publisher asked me and talk hosts asked me. And the one that is my favorite one is in the jacket flap. And I am standing between the Folgers and underneath a bust of Shakespeare. So, my friends at the Library of Congress, when tomorrow you gaze at the Folger Shakespeare Library across the street, please do so with a fuller appreciation of this great American story from the Gilded Age, the couple who earned good money and did good things with it. Also remember that it was a love story. Henry and Emily loved each other, and both loved Will. Theirs was the greatest ménage à trois in all of Anglo-American literary history. Thank you.
We do have time for a few questions. David will take them and
Sarah?
repeat them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's very interesting indeed. Hoover was not the only famous bibliophile president. Thomas Jefferson's first.
Oh, of course. I sit corrected. I sit corrected and somewhat embarrassed. Yes?
What sparked Mr. Folger's interest in Shakespeare?
There's several answers to that. If you go to the Folger Library,
Stephen, would you repeat the question?
I'm sorry, what sparked my original interest in, what sparked the Folger's interest in Shakespeare? If you go to the Folger Library, among the public spaces you can visit is the Founder's Room, where there is a ticket stub. Remember, he saved everything. It's a ticket stub to a lecture in May of 1879. It was in College Hall, which is an auditorium at Amherst. It was to hear Ralph Waldo Emerson, age 76, decrepit, helped up to the lectern by his daughter. The subject of his oration was not Shakespeare, but it led Folger to read what Emerson had written about Shakespeare. And since Folger had studied oratory and was a good orator and had won prizes in oratory, that is certainly one of the aspects which played a role. Folger was in a Shakespeare reading group when he was at college. The first book that is in the Folger collection in the Shakespeare area was the complete works of Shakespeare, published in 1875 by Lippincott in Philadelphia. And this was inscribed to Henry from his younger brother when Henry was a freshman. I don't have a brother, but I can't imagine that someone younger than a freshman in college would buy complete works of Shakespeare and give it to an older brother, but there it is. I've held it in my hands. There was a Shakespeare prize essay at Amherst, and Folger wrote the essay, but he lost the award. He didn't win. And Emily used to joke that it was because he lost the prize that he decided to go into collecting Shakespeare. But Henry said that had he not collected Shakespeare, he would have collected early music. It was one of his passions. He also said, had he not collected Shakespeare, he would have collected Frankliniana, anything to do with Benjamin Franklin, the first Folger who came from the New World in the 1660s. Henry Folger settled on Nantucket Island, married a woman, Mary Morrill, whom he met on the crossing. They had 10 children. The last child was Abiah Folger, who married Josiah Franklin, the candle maker, and they had a son, Benjamin Franklin. So Folgers and Franklins were related going back to the Nantucket and the Boston days. Another question? Yes?
How much of the collecting, Folger's collecting, continues today at the Folger?
How much of the collecting continues today at the Folger? Well, there's someone else in this room, Dan de Simone, who would be more apt to give a full answer, but what I will say is that the Folgers collected about 92,000 books, a lot more than books, but that was the figure for the books, mainly centered around Shakespeare, but touching on the main period of 1475 to 1715. And it wasn't only literary, but it also looked at the political and medical and horticultural and armorial areas and many more. The funds that the Folgers provided for the endowment was to include not only payment of staff, but also expansion of the collection. So what started out to be 92,000 books, I believe now is about 275,000 books. There have been a lot of gifts which have added to the collection, but it's still a vigorously active collection. And probably 2/3 of the people who come to use the collection are not looking at Shakespeare, they're looking at other items of interest. Yes?
I was a student of O.B. Hardison, Jr., and I know he was the head of the Folger many years after Mr. Folger died, but I was wondering if you did any research on him or any allusion to him in your book?
The questioner worked studied under O.B. Hardison, who was director of the Folger from 1969 to 1984. I still see his widow, Mary Frances Hardison. And the question is whether I have done any work related to him and the period where he was director. You'll see that the last chapter in the book, the epilogue, traces the Folger since the Folgers. So I went from 1932 to 2012. And I go through director by director. It became quite clear to me that of all the directors, there were more innovations under the Hardison directorship than any other. And I've talked to a number of people who worked with him, and he was a fountain of ideas and kept his staff very busy. One of the staff persons was Elizabeth Griffith, who later became head of Madeira School. She was a docent and reported that one day O.B. Hardison called her into his office and said, "We have to find out from any living Folger relative what they can tell us about the founders. We have nothing." And she put together a questionnaire sent out to the Folgers' nephews, nieces, grandnephews, grandnieces. The Folgers had no children. And unfortunately, the project never got off the ground. She left to work on a biography of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And I remember calling her up and I said, Elizabeth, I'm sure you have some working papers somewhere, lots of files I could go through. Nothing. But what I was able to do was to meet 6 grandnieces of the Folgers. They're all octogenarians. And they don't remember Henry, but they remember Emily. And the Folgers were single-minded in their attention to Shakespeare. They allowed family visits only twice a year, Thanksgiving and New Year's. And it was the same routine. The kids would go over the whole house, open every door. What did they find? Books, books, books. There would be a repast, and all of the children were expected to recite poetry, after which Emily would give each one a $5 check and a book. So the fact that I was able to meet grandnieces is about the best I could do, because I came along to this project. My graduation from Amherst was 84 years after Henry's. So I've met only one person who attended the dedication on April 23rd, 1932. And I said, what did you remember about it? She said, my leggings itched. Yes.
What about Jane F. Allen? Jane Folger Allen. I don't know if she's alive now.
All right, the question is, what about Jane F. Allen?
Yes. Jane Folger.
Folger.
Yes. Jane Folger Allen.
Jane Folger Allen. I must admit, I have not heard that name, but let me say this. Peter Folger, who came in 1660, is the, I guess you'd say, progenitor of Folgers all over the country. The one who is even better known than Henry is perhaps his uncle, James A. Folger, who founded Folger's Coffee. There are also Folgers in Washington, D.C. I've met 3 or 4. There's a Lee Folger, there's a John Folger. So there are a few Folgers. I don't know the ones that you have mentioned. Do we have time for one more question, John?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
I was struck by the difference between the almost modern exterior and the kind of ornate interiors of the building. I was wondering if there was discussion in the design around that question.
Yes.
My other question is...
I think we're going to stop with that one. So the design of the Folger strikes the viewer as being quite interesting from the exterior and for the interior. And the gentleman has put his finger on one of the first dilemmas which took place in discussions between client and architect. Henry Folger wanted an Elizabethan exterior. The architect said, that won't work. You can't do that on Capitol Hill. You can have an Elizabethan interior, and we'll work with you on that. And that is exactly what happened, and the Folgers accepted the architect's very strong position.
But it was a compromise, in a way, by having the figures. I mean, there's a Shakespeare element to the exterior. Somebody had to be a salesperson to persuade him. Isn't that true?
That's a good point. You do have Shakespearean figures on the outside.
On their quotations.
That's right. That's true. And
Descriptions.
that's right. So the Folgers selected the scenes and selected the captions, and the only bas-relief frieze that Folger saw before he died was the one of King Lear. And Lear was Folger's favorite Shakespeare character. And he visited the studio of the sculptor whose name was John Gregory, British-born, in New York, and looked at it. And when he went home, he said to it, I think to Gregory when he left, "You've done a fine job. I will sleep well tonight." And then the next morning, he wrote his consulting architect with 4 suggestions for changes. He wanted much more agony in the face. He wanted to see the veins in his arms. So he was, while he was around, you might say micromanaging, at least.
But he bought the idea.
Yes, he did.
And I think that's probably what counted.
Yeah, that's right.
Lucky that it was his favorite character he saw.
Right.
And admired.
And the Folgers insisted that these friezes be at eye level, not out of sight.
Any other questions for Stephen? Well, Stephen, thank you so much. This has really been thoughtful. I have a quick question. Is there a separate, I think the answer is no, but I'll ask it. There's no separate book on the building, on the construction of the building? Or is there a pamphlet?
I don't know of a pamphlet. I do know of a couple of books about Cray as an architect.
I do know those, yeah, but not
Yeah.
about the construction of the building.
Not yet.
Okay, there's another one, right? Well, please join me in thanking Stephen for a wonderful talk.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.